Good evening, class. I'm Sir Franz, and tonight we'll be learning about muscles. The first thing that you should understand about muscle is the obvious that it is the one responsible for movement, particularly gross movement of body parts or movements of fluids and materials that are circulated in the body or propelled through the gastrointestinal tract. So here is a wonderful table summarizing to you the differences between the three types of muscles in the body. So we have three types of muscles in the body: the skeletal muscles, which are attached to the bones, and once these muscles contract or shorten, they will pull on the bone, causing movement of a body part. No? For example, here shown is the biceps muscle. So the origin of the biceps muscle will be here in the shoulder. Ibig sabihin ng origin, this is the first point of attachment and is the stationary point of the attachment. And the insertion of the biceps muscle will be here in the proximal forearm. So, of course, they are attached to bones through tendons. So, whenever the biceps muscle will contract, the insertion, which is this one, will move towards the origin, which is here in the shoulder. So, through contraction or shortening of the muscle, this end will be pulled toward this end. And the gross movement that is produced is flexion of the elbow joint, which is this one, flexion of the elbow joint. So that is the general mechanism by which skeletal muscles contract. But you should also realize that skeletal muscles are also found in the face. So these are called facial muscles. And the insertion of the facial muscles will be underneath the skin, so that when the facial muscles contract, they will pull on the skin, and that will produce the characteristic facial expressions that you see. The cardiac muscle is found in the walls of the heart, and as these muscles contract, they will squeeze up a chamber of the heart and transfer the energy of contraction into the fluid, which is blood, causing the blood to propel into the next chamber or into the next great or big blood vessel, such as the pulmonary artery and the aorta. Now, the pulmonary artery being pumped blood by the right side of the heart, and the aorta being pumped blood by the left side of the heart. And lastly, smooth muscles are found in viscera. Ibig sabihin yan, organs, no? Of the body. So, understand na yung pagkain ninyo, as you swallow it, it passes through the gastrointestinal tract, the esophagus, the stomach, small intestines, and large intestines. So, ang tanong doon, paano gumagalaw yung food as it starts from the mouth and leaves the body in the gastrointestinal tract through the anus. So, paano yung paggalaw ng pagkain doon? It is through the rhythmic contraction of the smooth muscles that are found in these viscera, no? Viscera or organs, hollow viscera. So, ibig sabihin ng hollow, meron siyang butas sa gitna, and you will find the muscles around the lumen or the space. So comparing the three major muscle types according to how they look under the microscope, you will clearly see the differences. Yung skeletal muscle, they are single, yan. Okay, you will clearly see that the skeletal muscle cells are separated from each other. They are usually very long. They are cylindrical, as illustrated here. They are multinucleate cells, which means that for each cell, you will see more than one nucleus. So for example, in this cell that I'm pointing to, you will see 1, 2, and 3 nuclei. Better illustrated here sa baba. And they have very obvious striations. So what do we mean by striations? These are the thin, darker pink lines that you see that are perpendicular to the long axis of the skeletal muscle cell. Yan. Next, cardiac muscle. Itong cardiac muscle, striated din. So you will see fine lines also, but they are oriented parallel to the long axis of the muscle cell. Ayan. They are uninucleate. So ito yung difference niya with skeletal muscle. For each cardiac muscle cell, you will see that there is only one nucleus. So ito, isang muscle cell yan siya. But this single muscle cell has many compartments that are separated by intercalated discs. So, yung intercalated disc dito would be the darker line within a singular cardiac muscle cell, which is oriented perpendicular to the long axis of the cardiac muscle cell. So if you will take a closer and microscopic, more powerful view of the intercalated disc, makikita ninyo that impregnated in the intercalated disc, makikita niyo sa loob ng intercalated disc, ay mga gap junctions. So itong mga gap junctions, these are proteins that will allow movement of ions, no, between compartments of one and the next cardiac muscle cell. So, ibig sabihin nun, kung ano yung electrical potential that is generated by the ions in one portion of the cardiac muscle cell, it will have the ability to pass through the entire cardiac muscle cell and reach the other end of the cardiac muscle cell. So, ibig sabihin yan, yung intercalated disc will allow passage of ions and therefore passage of electrical potentials throughout the length or throughout the area kung saan makikita nyo yung intercalated disc. So, isang magandang term to describe the interactions between cardiac muscle cells is that they are a syncytium. No? Ibig sabihin ng syncytium, they are structurally separated, but because of the connections, the fine connections between individual cardiac muscle cells, they will function as one. Okay, so yun yung ibig sabihin ng term na syncytium. S-Y-N-C-Y-T-I-U-M, syncytium. Next is the smooth muscle. So kung makikita nyo from this microscopic photograph, wala talaga siyang striations. Kaya siya tinatawag na smooth. No? No striations means smooth. So the shape of the muscle is fusiform, which is this one. you will have tapered ends. Ibig sabihin, manipis yung two ends of the smooth muscle cell, and it is uninucleate. Okay? So, based on these microscopic characteristics, mayroon din tayong general cell behaviors, no? Yung skeletal muscle cell and cardiac muscle cell, because they are striated, they are generally very highly specialized. So, yung cell na ito, nag-transform siya into a form that is adapted to perform a very particular function. And because of that, these cells lose the ability to regenerate. So, ibig sabihin yan, kapag namatay yung cardiac muscle cell and even yung skeletal muscle cell, they will just undergo fibrosis, so magiging scar tissue sila, and they will not reform new cardiac muscle cells or skeletal muscle cells. Yung skeletal muscle cell, however, has satellite cells, no? Which are stem cells found in the periphery of the skeletal muscle. So, kapag namatay yung skeletal muscle portion na iyon, these satellite cells will replace the skeletal muscle cell that has died by transforming into new skeletal muscle. However, yung cardiac muscle cell, wala siyang ganun. So, kapag namatay siya, patay na talaga siya. No? That is why continuous or successive death of cardiac muscle, as in patients who have myocardial infarction, will eventually lead to very poor heart function kasi hindi siya na-replace. Here, you will see the connective tissue components of these three muscle cell types. So, connective tissue, ibig sabihin ng supporting structures, they give structural integrity and strength to the muscle. So, I will have a more detailed picture of this later on. But for the purpose of differentiating the three, yung cardiac muscle cells, cardiac muscle tissue, and smooth muscle tissue, the primary covering would be endomysium. Okay? And they do not have the larger coverings such as the perimysium and the epimysium. Okay? So, endomysium lang sila. Ibig sabihin, this connective tissue is tightly associated with individual muscle cells only. Next, for regulation of contraction, ibig sabihin yan, ano yung nagko-control na mag-contract itong tatlong muscle cell types na ito. For skeletal muscle, it's the nervous system, particularly the somatic motor nervous system. Okay? Next, for cardiac muscle, meron siyang involuntary sets of tissues that will generate electric potential na inherent sa heart itself. So, ibig sabihin nun, yung pacemaker na ito, no, will be able to generate electricity to cause the heart to contract even in the absence of other signals. So, kahit i-eviscerate mo, no? Tanggalin mo yung heart from the body itself, no? Ni-separate mo siya sa katawan. Because of this inherent pacemaker cells and tissues, the heart will be able to beat on its own, no? Even if separated from the body. And lastly, yung smooth muscle, meron din siyang ganun, meron din siyang pacemakers that we call the interstitial cells of Cajal na will generate the rhythmic contractions of the smooth muscles of the body, particularly the gastrointestinal tract. However, these are subject to modifications, no? Yung activity ng smooth muscle na to, very much affected by hormones, chemicals, and even stretch of the lumen, no? Of the gastrointestinal tract. Okay, so ang dami na, no? Let's just recap where you find these attached to bones, in the heart, smooth muscle, anywhere else in the body, but particularly the gastrointestinal tract and the blood vessels. No? Appearance, skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle, both are striated. Skeletal muscle, multinucleated, cardiac muscle, uninucleated, and you have here the intercalated disc. Smooth muscles are tapered and they do not have striations. That's why they are called smooth. Connective tissue components, the most invested would be the skeletal muscle cells, which have endomysium, okay, perimysium, and epimysium. Regulation of contraction, the skeletal muscle cells controlled directly by the somatic nervous system. Cardiac muscle cells and smooth muscle cells have their own pacemakers. The heart pacemaker being very involuntary and not needing to receive various signals, whereas yung smooth muscle tissue pacemaker is also involuntary. It will act on its own, but it is very much affected by hormones and neurotransmitters and even stretch of the visceral wall. So ito yung closer look natin sa skeletal muscle. So yung individual muscle cell here ay ito lang, no? When you group individual muscle cells together, yan, tigi-isang muscle cell yan siya. Okay? You form a fascicle. Ito yung fascicle. So, multiple fascicles, yan, will make up a muscle organ, which is this one. So, ito yung cell. Ito yung tissue level. Yan. And ito yung organ level of muscle. So, a covering of an individual muscle fiber or otherwise known as a muscle cell is the endomysium. Covering of the fascicle is the perimysium, and covering of the entire skeletal muscle organ is the epimysium, which is this one. Okay? So here, you will see that the epimysium continuously fuses and becomes thicker to form the tendon, no? Which is attached to the bone. Dito naman, ang microscopic illustration ng inyong smooth muscle. So, this is particular for the gastrointestinal tract, no? Itong cross-section na ito. So, where do you find the smooth muscle layer in the gastrointestinal tract? It is underneath the submucosa. So, this is the mucosa. Dito dadaan yung pagkain. Nandito yung mga enzymes na magdadigest sa kanya. At saka nandito din yung structures, particularly in the submucosa, the blood vessels, where the digested nutrients are absorbed and transferred into the blood, no? Here in the submucosa. Submucosa, sub, ibig sabihin yan sa ilalim. So, submucosa, ilalim ng mucosa. Okay, this one. Underneath the submucosa is the smooth muscle layer already. So in the gastrointestinal tract, we have two layers of smooth muscles. An inner circular, yan. So tingnan nyo yung orientation. Yan, paikot siya. An inner circular smooth muscle layer and an outer longitudinal. So kung titingnan nyo yung pointer ko, and you will look at this, no, microscopic illustration or photo, makikita nyo na yung smooth muscle has been cut, yung outer longitudinal, ito, na smooth muscle layer has been cut cross-section. So, ibig sabihin yan, yung fiber niya, kung ilalatag nyo siyang pahaba, would be pointing towards you. Okay? So, ibig sabihin nun, longitudinal siya. Along the axis of the, for example, the intestines, kung yung axis ay from left to right, yung direction or orientation ng smooth muscle will also be from left to right. Okay? So, pahaba. No? Here, you will appreciate the relationship of the cardiac muscle fibers relative to the cardiac skeleton. Okay? So, ito yung cardiac skeleton, yung puti. And ito yung cardiac muscle bundles. You will see that they are spirally oriented. No? So, naka-spiral yan siya. So, once contraction sets in, because of this spiral shape, the overall effect would be the squeezing of the lumen of the chambers of the heart. So, for example, ito, atrial muscle, when this atrial muscle, so atrial, ibig sabihin, found in the atria, no? Atrium and ventricle. So when this atrial muscle contracts, because it is oriented in a circular and spiral direction, then it will squeeze the chamber and transfer the force into the blood, increasing the pressure carried by the blood and causing the valves in between the atrium and the ventricle to shut, to force open. Kasi mas mataas na yung pressure niya compared sa resistance ng valve. So, pupunta yung dugo from here to here because of the pressure generated by this muscle. And likewise, here in the right ventricle area, no, where the outflow or yung lalabasan ng dugo ay yung great vessel, which is this one, the pulmonary trunk. Blood will be able to enter the pulmonary trunk because it has attained enough pressure generated by the cardiac muscle, which is this one, the ventricularis, no? Or the ventricular muscle. Punta dito. Yung dugo. So, dito sa image na to, pinapakita ang microscopic anatomy ng isang individual skeletal muscle cell. So, here, this is an entire cell in itself, no? The sarcolemma, which is this one, is basically the plasma membrane of the skeletal muscle cell. Ito yung nucleus. And what's special with muscle cells is that they have a special organelle. So, kung i-review ninyo yung basic structure ng isang cell, you will recall that there are many organelles which perform particular functions. For example, yung vacuole, yun ay isang organelle na mag-store ng foodstuffs and wastes. Ano pa? Ribosomes, those are organelles that perform protein synthesis and they generate proteins. Yung Golgi apparatus, those are organelles that package intracellular material, no? Proteins, lipids, so pinapackage yun ang Golgi apparatus. In skeletal muscle, you have this special organelle that you call the myofibril, no? And yung purpose lang, ng myofibril would be to produce contraction. And as you will observe, the myofibrils occupy a lot of space of the skeletal muscle. Ibig sabihin yan, yun talaga yung specialized organelle that allow the special function of the skeletal muscle or any muscle cell in particular, which is contraction. At the outright, ito yung makikita nyo yung striations, no, ng skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle. So, relative to the striations, meron kang dark band, ito, at saka light band. Yan. So, etong dark and light bands, yan yung parang appearance that is generated by these smaller microscopic structures. Okay? So, ito yung dark band. Yan. If you will connect the dots, no? Ito yung dark band represented in the myofibril. And ito yung light band. Yan. So, if we take a closer look at the myofibril, this is what we will encounter, that it's also cylindrical and impregnated within this cylinder are proteins. No? So, these proteins form myofilaments. So, huwag tayong malito ha, from larger structure to smaller structures tayo. This is the muscle cell or the muscle fiber. Okay? Ang organelle niya, myofibril. And ang component ng myofibril, which are big proteins, are called myofilaments. Yan. Yung components na yan, yung pink, blue, those are myofilaments. Okay? So, ang ating thin myofilament, which is the blue one, manipis lang naman talaga siya. Correct. Is called actin. No? Yung protein na nagme-make up ng thin myofilament is actin. And yung protein na nagme-make up ng thick myofilament is myosin, which is this one. Okay, ayan. So, you will see particular relationships within this image. Yung actin, the blue ones, are connected to each other around the myofilament through this zigzag line. Siya yung nag-a-anchor ng actin. And this is called the Z-disc. Okay? Ito siya. So please remember these structures kasi later magagamit natin siya. No? You will also see here na meron ding naka-anchor sa thick myofilament, which is myosin, the dark red line. Meron ding naka-anchor sa kanya. And around the around the myofibril, this anchor is the H zone, which is made up of this particular protein, no? Siya yung kumbaga nagsa-stabilize ng myosin, itong yellow structure na to, on a closer microscopic or ultra microscopic image. Ito ultra microscopic na to. Sobrang magnified niya na. So itong nag-anchor na to is what you call titin. T-I-T-I-N. So that is quite advanced, but you can read about that, no, in your molecular biology. Titin. T-I-T-I-N. It anchors the myosin, no, along the Z disc. Yan siya. Okay. So if lastly, appreciate this one, no? Etong ultra microscopic image. Ito yung Z disc. Yan. And each portion or point of the Z disc, you will see actin. And look at how myosin and actin are arranged relative to each other. Ano siya? They are interspersed, no? Actin, tapos myosin, actin, tapos myosin. Okay? And here introduced in this image are these blobs, no? Mga blobs. Yan. Okay. Etong mga blobs na ito, mga bilog-bilog na yan, those are your myosin head, no? Ulo, head, H-E-A-D. You have here the head, and you have here, if you will expand this one, this is actually like, para siyang toge, no? Meron siyang ulo at saka buntot. Yung buntot nito is this one, no? Naka-orient siya dito sa gitna. So the head is oriented in the periphery, no? Sa gilid siya ng inyong myofilament. Again, the head is in the periphery of the myofilament, and its tail is oriented towards the center. So yung ulo nasa gilid, ulo ng toge ay nasa gilid, tsaka yung buntot ng toge o yung roots, di ba, ng toge nandito sa gitna. And because these are made up of many, no, marami-rami yung mga units na ito na nagkumpul-kumpul, you will have a conglomeration of their buntots here in the middle. Okay? Kaya smooth na siya dyan sa gitna. Okay. So ito dinescribe na natin for neurons in our last lesson. But here, illustrated is the motor end plate. Etong structure na ito, yan. You have here the neuron, and then the muscle, and then here is the synaptic cleft, no? Etong tatlong structures na ito, the neuron, the muscle, and the synapse, this is what you call the motor end plate. So last time, when we discussed neurotransmission, nalaman natin na information travels along the length of the neuron from its soma to its axon as an electric potential, no? As an action potential in the form, parang siyang kuryente. Travels down in the form of kuryente, and then pagdating niya sa dulo, yung kuryente na yon, which is the information in itself, is converted into a chemical signal in the form of neurotransmitters. So these neurotransmitters are released into the synapse and follow chemical behaviors, no? Diffusion, yung mga ganun-ganun, no? This chemical property of neurotransmitters in connection with the electrical nature of information along the length of the neuron makes neurotransmission an electrochemical process. Okay? So, dito naman, sa pag-discuss natin ng skeletal muscle, you have to recall that the regulation of muscular contraction in skeletal muscle is through the action of neurons, no? Particularly neurons from the somatic nervous system, which is part of the peripheral nervous system. So, ibig sabihin lang nun, yung nagpapakontract sa skeletal muscle ay neurons. So, tingnan natin paano nangyayari yun. Dito, dumating na yung kuryente sa dulo ng axon. And ito na yung mga axonal buttons. And each axonal button interacts with the skeletal muscle fiber or skeletal muscle cell in multiple points. And each point here, each point of contact is a motor end plate, which is this one. So, basahin lang natin, no? Wala naman masyadong pinagkaiba, but the difference here is the relative to neuron-neuron interaction. Dito naman sa neuron-muscle interaction, in the motor end plate, otherwise known as the neuromuscular junction. Ito yung neuromuscular junction, NMJ, no? First thing that you will observe here, this is rather convoluted. Ibig sabihin, liko-liko, naka-fold yung sarcolemma dito sa neuromuscular junction. And this folding serves to increase the surface area of the skeletal muscle cell membrane that is in contact with the neuron. So because the surface area is larger, more neurotransmitters can enter here and more can interact with the cell membrane. Okay, so let's just read. Number 1, the nerve impulse reaches the axon terminal or the motor neuron. So, ito yung action potential and ito yung depolarization wave natin. And if this becomes positive already, the voltage-gated calcium channels will open and calcium will enter the neuron, and the levels of calcium inside the axonal button will increase. That will cause, so natin sa number 3, calcium entry causes some synaptic vesicles to release their contents. So dahil dumami na yung calcium dito, mag-fuse na yung vesicles, this one which contain the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. No? Mag-fuse siya with the cell membrane of the neuron, releasing the acetylcholine into the synapse. So at number 4 na tayo, acetylcholine diffuses across the synaptic cleft and binds to receptors in the sarcolemma. Here. Number 5, as it binds to the sarcolemma, it opens the sodium channel. So, ibig sabihin, this sodium channel here is ligand-gated. Sodium enters, and the entire muscle length, so yung region na to, magiging positively charged na. Kasi pumasok na yung sodium inside the muscle cell through the action of the acetylcholine receptor, which causes the sodium channel to open. Ayan. So, etong region na to magiging positive na din. And like in the neuron, no, continuously, this area will progressively become positive. Okay? Palibot sa area na to. So what's the next step? Because this area right here has become positive, calcium will now be able to enter from the outside into the inside of the skeletal muscle cell. So parehas lang din yung sa neurotransmission. But another special feature of the skeletal muscle is that it has this organelle, which is the sarcoplasmic reticulum, no? Which is a specialized form of endoplasmic reticulum that holds calcium. So sa loob ng skeletal muscle cell, marami siyang stored calcium. And whenever the electric potential integrates into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, calcium, which is stored, is released. So ibig sabihin yan, pag merong action potential na dumating sa skeletal muscle, yung fluid inside the skeletal muscle cell rapidly becomes enriched with calcium. And what is the next step? No, eto na, and this is my last slide already. Here is a closer molecular look at actin. So remember niyo yung structure ng actin kanina, no? Yun yung thin na myofilament, no? Yun yung actin. If we will take a closer look at actin, we will see this. That actin is actually a complex, no? Maraming structures na nagme-make up sa actin. So yung actin dito, yung actual actin is actually just this light pink structure. Yan. Na nakatwist around this darker pink structure, which is tropomyosin. Okay? And tropomyosin, the dark pink structure, holds or is associated with the troponin complex. Okay? So let's break that down, no? Actin is made up of a lot of structures. You have F-actin, which stands for filamentous actin. Filamentous, ibig sabihin, para na siyang thread. Kasi, yung actual actin molecules, mga bilog-bilog lang yan sila. No? These are globular proteins. But when these globular proteins, mga bilog-bilog na ito, nagdikit-dikit, no? They form filamentous actin. And the bigger filamentous actin is already thread-like. Ito na siya yung pink. Okay? The next structure in the actin complex is tropomyosin, which is tightly adhered to actin. So nakapalibot lang din siya, nakatwist together with actin. And the last structure, which is oriented with tropomyosin. So etong pangatlong structure na to, yung point of attachment niya is tropomyosin. No? Etong third structure na to is the troponin complex. So yung troponin complex, meron tayong tatlo, no? Troponin T, letter T, troponin T, which is attached to tropomyosin. Troponin F, which is attached and covers the active site of the actual actin. So meron na tayong dalawa na troponin, no? Dito sa structure na to, tatlo, di ba? So yung isa dito, troponin T, na nakadikit sa tropomyosin. The other troponin is troponin F, which is associated with filamentous actin. No? Yan. And lastly, you have troponin C, which will orient or stick with calcium. So meron tayong tatlong troponin. May isang nakadikit sa actin, may isang nakadikit sa tropomyosin, and may isang nakadikit sa calcium. Okay? So troponin C, yung nakadikit sa calcium, yung didikit sa calcium. So in the baseline, no, yung hindi pa activated yung actin, yung active sites natatabunan ng inyong troponin at saka tropomyosin. But once calcium inside the skeletal muscle cell or any other muscle cell increases, it will bind to troponin, and that binding of calcium with troponin C will cause a change in the shape of tropomyosin and troponin so that the active sites are now open. They are now bukas na sila para makapag-bind doon si myosin. So sa simula, nakatago pa lang yung mga active sites ng actin. Pero kapag dumami na yung calcium sa loob ng muscle cell, the active sites become free and liberated, and they will now be able to entertain myosin. So yun yung role ng calcium. At saka yun yung reason bakit kanina sa transmission of action potentials into the muscle cell, yung endpoint niya is the increase in skeletal muscle cell calcium. Kasi yung calcium yung magbubukas ng active sites. And lastly, it's this one. Ito yung mechanism of muscle cell contraction. And ang tawag natin sa mechanism na ito is the ratchet mechanism or the walk-along mechanism of skeletal muscle cell contraction. So sa book ninyo, ang tawag dito ay the sliding filament theory, no? But another term for this would be the walk-along theory. Kasi kapag walk-along, mas mabilis siyang intindihin, no? So ngayon, ito yung actin, ito yung myosin, at saka ito yung mga ulo ng myosin. So these are the myosin cross bridges. Ito siya. Yan. Ito yung buntot niya. And ito, mahaba pa yung buntot, and it will fuse to form the myosin filament. Okay? So ito yung active sites. Active sites mean doon didikit yung myosin cross bridge. No? So once calcium has reached the troponin C in the troponin complex, the active sites now become open for binding. So yung ipapa-illustrate natin dito would be the walk-along theory. No? So first, mayroong ATP, adenosine triphosphate, na didikit dito sa ulo, no? Sa myosin cross bridge. Yung ATP, adenosine triphosphate na iyon, will hydrolyze, no? Ibig sabihin, it will be broken down. And the bonds within ATP that hold energy will be broken down also. And that energy will be transferred into the head of this myosin cross bridge. So, ibig sabihin nun, pag hydrolyze ng ATP, magiging energetic itong myosin cross bridge. Okay? So, ang mangyayari niyan, didikit siya sa active site. Once the active site is now open because of the changes in troponin, no? And tropomyosin. So pagdikit ng myosin cross bridge sa active site, a set of chemical reactions will occur. And those chemical reactions will then allow the cross bridge to stick with the active site and then change conformation. So, pagdikit niya dito, mag-change yung shape and direction ng cross bridge para siyang mag-flex, no? Here, yan, perpendicular pa siya sa actin filament. And then, pag nangyari na yung chemical reactions dito, it will now flex towards this bridge, no, ng inyong myosin filament. So, dikit, and then, nakadikit na yan, and then it will flex towards the hinge. So, mag-flex siya towards the hinge. So, this movement here, yung flexing na yon towards the hinge, is what you call the power stroke. Okay? And yung pag-flex na yon, remember, nakadikit na siya dito. So, habang fineflex niya yon, yan, habang nagmo-move siya towards the hinge, etong ulo na part, it drags along the entire actin filament. So, eto, magmo-move papunta dito. No? So, pag move niya papunta doon, it will then disengage. Okay? So, yung point of attachment na na-establish natin kanina, pag na-move niya na yung actin filament, another ATP molecule will bind to the myosin cross bridge, and it will cause the disengagement of the attachment here. Pero, nakagalaw na yung actin filament papunta dito. And then, pag nag-bind na yung ATP, maha-hydrolyze yung ATP ulit, the energy within the bonds of ATP will be released again, and that will cock the cross bridge back to its starting position, where it will now be able to attach again on the active site. Okay, so complicated yun konti, no? But ulitin natin para mag-stick in sa minds ninyo. So, ang goal natin dito ay mapagalaw yung actin. So, yung gumagalaw, yung actin itself, yung nagpapagalaw sa kanya, yung myosin. So, sa myosin, makikita nyo na meron siyang ulo. Ulo ng toge, buntot ng toge. Yun yung parang natin, no? Ways to illustrate the structure of the myosin filament. Yung buntot ng toge will extend here, and this will bunch up together to form the entire myosin filament. This structure here, yung parang golf, no? Golf club, is the myosin cross bridge. The myosin cross bridge has this particular structure, the head, no? Ito, ulo, head. So, this myosin cross bridge is attached to the myosin filament through the hinge, which is this one. Okay, so na-orient na tayo. Ito yung actin filament with its active sites. So ito naman talaga siya, yung interaction nila hindi mangyayari hanggat may cover itong active site. And the one that covers the active site is tropomyosin and troponin F. Okay? Pag may calcium na, which is the endpoint of neurotransmission, this active site will become free kasi wala na yung wala nang nakabalot sa kanya. It is now uncovered. So now, let us understand the walk-along mechanism. So let's start with this one. Nakadikit pa, no? Nakadikit pa yung myosin head doon sa active site. So nakadikit na siya. Paano natin siya matatanggal sa pagkakadikit? Mayroong adenosine triphosphate, which is the intracellular currency of energy. May ATP na didikit dito. Pagdikit ng ATP dito, mayroong enzymes dito na mag-hydrolyze or magse-separate ng bonds ng ATP, forming adenosine diphosphate and phosphate. So dahil na-separate natin yung bonds na yun, yung energy contained within the bond is transferred here into the head of the myosin light chain. So, eto, after nag-hydrolyze yung ATP, it becomes energized already. And as it becomes energized, it cocks to this position. Parang yung pagkasamo ng baril, no? Yun yung cocking na mechanism. So from here, it detaches and cocks papunta dito. Now, the shape of the myosin light chain head will already be perpendicular to the actin filament. So dito, meron na siyang potential energy, no? So, after that one, and the active site becomes free, didikit na ngayon yung myosin light chain head dito sa active site. Kasi wala nang tabon sa kanya. So, pag dumikit na siya dyan, remember, it has potential energy. A set of chemical reactions will occur between actin and the myosin light chain head. And those chemical reactions will result to a change in the shape and orientation of the myosin light chain head, such that it will now move towards its hinge. So from this orientation, gaganon siya, no? And as it moves towards the hinge, remember that the actin has been attached. The actin will also move towards this direction. And it's the walk-along mechanism. Kasi, pag dikit niya dyan, magpa-flex siya papunta dito. And then, may ATP na magbabind, ma-release siya, babalik siya dito. The next point of attachment will be this one, going here, and another going here. So, para kang nagte-take ng steps, no? On the length of the actin filament. And as this myosin light chain continue to take steps, the actin progressively moves towards this direction. So yun yung walk-along mechanism. Na ang magpapasimula ng lahat ng yon, yung pagdami ng calcium inside the skeletal muscle. Okay? So I hope you go along with this lecture, watch it again and again, and then read your book. And hopefully, you'll be able to master these concepts, which you will need for your future studies and subjects. Remember, there are drugs that affect many phases of neuromuscular contraction. And at the end of it all, you'll be able to change how the body functions. You'll be able to change how the heart beats. You'll be able to change how the gastrointestinal tract functions. No, you'll be able to alter how muscles will contract. Will they contract more? Will they contract less? With the medications that you have, no? And your understanding of how those medications work will ultimately depend on this, no? Naiintindihan nyo ba paano nagko-contract yung muscle? Naiintindihan nyo ba paano transfer ng information from neuron to muscle? Okay? So those will be the applications of this lecture. So I hope you get encouraged and you have motivation to read and learn. Thank you.